What is poetry and how do I read it? It feels a bit daunting, to be honest with you, to give this talk at a literature camp where people are already poets. They presumably know what they're doing, and they know how to read poetry. I'm coming at this primarily from the standpoint of a teacher of poetry, more than a writer of poetry. I've studied and written about poetry quite a bit. I teach it at the high school level, also some at the beginner college level. So this really is an introductory kind of course, and for those of you who are more advanced in the art of reading and writing poetry, I hope you can find some inspiration, something useful as well. Much of the content of the presentation I'm taking from Mary Oliver's Poetry Handbook, which is where I get this opening quote. Mary Oliver, who is a poet, writes a wonderful little book that I would recommend if you're interested in getting into poetry, both reading and writing it. I'm discovering that the resources, I've been doing a bit more with the craft of poetry recently, and I find that is very helpful for me in reading it versus just thinking about how to read it. Getting into the craft of it helps me as a reader as well. But this statement, a rock is not a stone. What does Oliver mean by this? A rock is not a stone. Any initial reflections from you all? What's the difference here? In your mind, what's the difference between a rock and a stone?
A rock, in my opinion, is firmly planted and a stone is always movable.
Okay. A rock is firmly planted, a stone is always movable. If I were to show you two pictures, and just I'm getting the answer that I want here, but what are these out of the two options? Rocks. What are these? Stones. Well, obviously there are only two. Why? Rocks are much bigger. Okay. Rocks are rougher. Rocks. And this is there's some variation. I've done this exercise with many students over the years that I've been teaching this, but consistently, I'd say about 80% say these are stones, these are rocks. Now, if you think about the word rock, rock ends with a mute, which is a consonant that cannot be aspirated. You can't go rock unless you're speaking Arabic. Like rock, you have to stop it. It stops, right? So it's very abrupt. It stops the breath. There's also something about the angularity. If you see the word rock, the K is a very angular, rough, jagged, kind of thing. And it might even have to do with the solidity of it. It's planted. It's firm. Stone, on the other hand, it begins with what Oliver calls a semivowel, which is a consonant whose sound can be protracted. You can hold that out for as long as you want. You hit the mute, which is a T, but it's quickly softened by a long vowel. Stone, and then you end with this very liquid N. And so the word itself is very smooth and quite naturally our minds, especially if we're given the option, stones are smooth, 5 smooth little stones that David picked up from the brook. Rocks are hard, and it has to do something to do with the word itself. And that's, as a kind of introduction to poetry, that's what poetry does. It's very concerned about not just the meaning that a word carries, the word as a vehicle, but the word as a thing in itself. Getting as close as possible to bridging that gap in Western, metaphysics between the idea and the thing. But think about other words, related words. The English language is just wonderful. Boulder, think about the solidity of boulder. It's boom. You have bold, right? Right there in the middle of the word, right? It's big. It's imposing. It's solid. Then the word pebble. Pebble. You throw a pebble into a creek. What sound does it make? Bink, pebble. And you have it right there in the pebble. I'm of the conviction that most of language is at its core onomatopoeic. I know there's some theories, there's probably linguists would probably disagree with me, but at some level, I think it holds. So what is poetry? First of all, poetry, just looking at the root of the word, it comes from the Greek word poiesis, having to do with making something. And until modern times, or more recent, modern times, like the 1500s, 1600s, there wasn't much distinction between, they just call it poesy, made literature and like fiction, to the degree that there was fiction, and poetry, which we kind of, in our modern mind, connotes, has something to do with rhyme, and the words don't really go all the way across the page. So there wasn't this sharp distinction between just literature in general, imaginative literature in general, and poetry in particular. But it has to do with something that's made. It's crafted, it's art. Mary Oliver calls it a structure of lines and rhythmic energy and repetitive sound. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, also a poet from the Romantic period, says the best words in the best order. And as poets are wont to do, Marianne Moore, in her famous poem about how she dislikes poetry, gives this idea as poems as imaginary gardens with real toads in them. But poetry is interested in the fullness of the word, and so it has this kind of incarnational aspect to it. The structure of the word, the shape of the word, the sound of the word, the sense of the word. Again, the word is a concrete thing, not merely a vehicle for an idea. And it's imaginative in that poetry attempts to break open new ways of seeing the world. We get used to the same old ideas, the same metaphors, and poetry doesn't always have to be doing something just extravagantly new, and yet there's something fresh about it in that it helps us see the world from a different perspective. It breaks open the world. It's kind of, I think of poems as windows on the world that I might not have encountered, or windows on the world that that someone else gives to me. Hey, look at the world through in this way. Billy Collins, one of my recent favorite poets, says poets are people who can't say one thing at a time. Meaning that they have to, of course, like a word means three different things, and if you think it means, you're not sure which one it means, well, it means all of those things, right? So poets are people who can't say one thing at a time. Collins talks about in his masterclass on poetry, he talks about poetry demanding participation from the reader, and this is one of the reasons that poetry sometimes turns people off or turns people away, is they find it inaccessible. And he acknowledges that poetry demands more participation from the reader than any other form of writing. So if you have cookbooks on the one side that are trying to be clear and very informative and telling you how to do it, like we want clarity, we want to know what we're doing with cookbooks. There isn't much poetic about cookbooks, although try me. Poets are always trying things. So some of you have probably written recipes as poems, right? So the possibilities are endless. But a cookbook as a cookbook is not trying to be poetic in most cases. On the other hand, then you have poetry, which is not trying to be a cookbook. It's trying to do something else. It's trying to pull you into a world of its own, and then in pulling you into that world, help you see the world that you're in. I think it's helpful to think of poems as rooms. Like you enter this room that a poet has created, and like, okay, what is this? How do I get around? And Collins interestingly talks about. I haven't written much poetry. I do some, but he talks about poets when they're writing poetry. They get into this room and they're like, how do I get out of this thing? Like most of the poem is the poet trying to get out of the poem. And that the poem is over when you're out of the room, right? So leave it to poets. I'm kind of on this line between academic and poet, and leave it to poets to be. But I found that poets poets talking about how to write poetry is very intriguing because it gives you, they can't help but be poetic in talking about it. Similarly, reading a poem can be like fumbling around a dark room looking for a light switch. And Collins, in this wonderful little poem, Introduction to Poetry, gives us this image. And if you're interested in poetry but not sure where to start, I would recommend Collins. He's very accessible. There's depth there, but it's not T.S. Eliot. It's the level of interpretive pressure. You don't have to exert just a tremendous amount of interpretive pressure on Collins's poetry. It's there. It's very welcoming. It draws you in, and I think it's captured in this Introduction to Poetry, which is him writing about his teaching a poetry class. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. And interestingly, room, stanza, the etymology for stanza is room. And so there's this direct connection between room and poem. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So Collins is, of course, pushing us here to think of poetry not as the temptation, especially for pedants like myself, is to tie the poem to a chair and torture confession out. Well, what does it mean? What is it saying, right? Couldn't you just be clear, right? But that's not really what the poem is trying to do. It's not necessarily always trying to be unclear. But it's not. Poems respond to loving attention. They don't typically respond very well to being beaten with hoses. I tell my students, my high school students, that you have to like, and I mentioned this a bit later. Poems are like very shy clams. Like if you spend enough time with them, eventually they'll open up. But if you try forcing it, they're gonna close up, right? So we have to bring. We have to gain the poem's trust in most cases before it gives itself to us. They are alive things. Poems can be difficult, but good poems give in proportion and beyond what we give to them. And yes.
Just now I'm seeing, he didn't, now I might be beating this with a hose, but feel the walls for a light switch instead of a hose? That has nothing, is that intentional?
You mean
a light switch.
Oh, a light. Oh my! I'm never going to be able to see this the same again. They might respond to a light switch, and possibly. Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm sure Collins would be delighted. But wow, you're really throwing me there. In the description for this session, I don't have it in front of me, but I reference M.H. Abrams, who says that the necessary but not sufficient condition for being a good reader of poetry is having a keen eye for the obvious. We typically want, when we approach especially a difficult poem, we want to immediately start beating it with a hose. The place to start more often is to notice what is most obvious. The fact that light switch could be both light switch and a light switch, right? It's very obvious. It's right there in front of you. There's nothing really hidden about it. Who knows if Collins intended it or not? That's usually not the most interesting question, but that's the wonder of language. Poetry is about the experience of language. So I'm going to structure the rest of this time just looking at elements of poetry. And again, I'm getting these all, there's different ways that we could look at this. I'm getting these from Mary Oliver's Poetry Handbook. Poems do operate a certain way. There's certain things that, as a genre of literature, we've come to expect of them. And they typically involve these 5 things. And there's even some overlap within these 5 things: sound, line, voice, imagery, and form. And I'm going to walk through each of these, talk about some of the subcategories of these things. Think of these as tools for you to, I should come up with a better metaphor than tools, because I don't want to be so mechanical, but for the sake of this conversation, tools for you to start looking at poetry, to know what to look for, because there is this, there is the reality, that if you know what something is supposed to contain, you know what to look for. As I am not very well versed in visual art, I can look at a painting and I can start noticing things. That's a good place to start. But the more you realize, the more you do that, the more you're aware. You attune your awarenesses to you know what to look for. You look at color. You look at perspective. All of that. It's helpful. So this is the equivalent of that. And for each of these, I'm going to have multiple. We're going to do a lot of surface reading of poems. Hopefully, delightfully. We're not going to close read. What I mean by that is we're not going to close read all of these, but for each of these elements, I have some selections from poems kind of across the spectrum we can look at. So sound, first of all, sound has to do with the sounds of words. We looked at this already with like individual words. We looked at this with stone and rock, for instance. That's what we're talking about. Combinations of letters give us certain impressions, certain feelings. Rock, stone. There's also onomatopoeia, which is very, very common in poetry. Words sound like what they do. But then we also have patterns of words. Alliteration, which is the repeated beginning consonant sounds. Dapple, dawn, drawn, falcon. Dapple, dawn, drawn. Consonants, which is repeated consonant or consonant sounds, not necessarily at the beginning of words. So repeated consonant sounds within words. Assonants, repeated vowels or vowel sounds. And then rhyme, which is what most everybody, if they don't know anything about poetry, knows that poems should do, is that they should rhyme, which of course they don't need to. But we often associate, popular imagination of poetry often associates rhyme with poetry, which is the sonic correspondence between words. They sound similar. So for most of these elements, I'm going to start with this poem by Robert Frost. If you've done high school literature, you're probably familiar with it. I'm stopping by woods on a snowy evening, and this is not a poem that has been like really big for me over the years, but the more I dwell with it, the more I like. It's the pinnacle of, like, if you're into form, it is the pinnacle of formal poetry. It's just magnificent. So I'm going to read it and then highlight a few things, particularly having to do with sound. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. One of the most obvious parts of this is a poem that rhymes, right? It's a very intricate rhyme scheme. If you notice, I'm going to try writing on this, but I might have some trouble. Whose woods these are, I think I know. And this is end rhyme. Sometimes you have internal rhyme where there's rhyming within lines, but this is end rhyme where the ends of his house is in the village, though. He will not see me here, stopping here to watch to watch his woods fill up with snow. So you have, if we're, I'm not going to try writing because I'm not good with my trackpad, but you have A, A, B, A. So you have no, though, here, snow. But notice that the next stanza picks up with B. So my little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake. So there's our C, the darkest evening of the year. So then there's B, B, C, B. And of course, we've established a pattern, we know what to expect, and then we begin the third stanza with shake, which rhymes with lake. And so there's this very, very delicate, just wonderful rhyme scheme here. So that's an element of sound, probably the most classic or the most obvious element of sound. Specific words. Well, there's some alliteration here. The only other sounds the sweep. You have this alliteration between sound, sweep, of easy wind and downy flakes. So there's, again, that S sound, easy. It's more of a Z, I guess. But the S sound already starts back here. Ask if there's some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep. So you have snow that's sweeping sound of snow. Gives his harness bells a shake. There's that shake. It ends in that, shaking of bells. All the other sounds are smooth, but then there's this sudden, you hear the jangle of the harness bells. I think we'll leave that. All of these we could spend most of our time on these. Of course, the king of sound poetry, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and this one's just the first four lines of his "As Kingfishers Catch Fire." As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. So it's, as kingfishers catch fire, alliteration, kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw, but then you have the correspondence between fire and flame. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. With kingfishers, you have the beginning of this sound, this assonance. Kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, and then this is just really, it continues here. As tumbled over rim, in roundy well, stones ring. So but then probably the most obvious one here sonically is the sound. Like each tucked string tells. So we have string, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. So you have bells tolling, and what sound do bells make? Bong, 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 right? So the words are doing sonically are doing what he's talking about here. But it doesn't have to be just exuberant kinds of sounds. Listen to the Hollow Men, the opening lines of the Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot. We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpieces filled with straw. Alas, our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. So this is a desiccated sounds by this dried voices when we whisper together are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. It's a very, very dry sound. Of course, corresponds with "We Are the Hollow Men." And then finally, a wonderful poem by a relatively unknown, little-known poet, Vassar Miller, an American poet who's very much in the metaphysical tradition. Since water lacks lexicons, rain refuses translation, try as I may to render it. Crouching low at the passage where sound peels away from silence, a cleavage no mind can perceive. Crawling between heartbeat and heartbeat after that nice precision, shimmering language of liquid. None shapes a goblet of words from which you can hope to sip the delicate racket of rain. So the problem of the poem, of course, is rain. You can't translate rain. And yet she does kind of. Since water lacks lexicons, what I'm struck by sonnet, like with the sound here, is not so much that there really is no rhyme, at least end rhyme, but notice the wet sounds, lacks lexicons, rain refuses translation. So we have these repeated L sounds. Rain, R's and L's are wet sound, I think. Crouching low at the passage where sound peels away from silence. A cleavage no mind can perceive. So there, again, crouching low, cleavage. Shimmering language of liquid, there are those L sounds again. But then at the end, you hear this delicate racket of rain. It's not so much, it's still wet, but it's a pattering, right? I mean, maybe the storm, maybe the rain is easing up, I don't know. From which none shapes a goblet of words from which you can hope to sip the delicate racket of rain. And there we're getting into some rhythm as well that does interesting things with the sound of rain. So second element, and I'm going to have to keep cruising here. Line. One of the most distinctive things about poetry, at least most poetry, is that it is not governed by the margins of the paper. Prose goes yada, 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 hits the margin, bumps down to the next line. And again, of course, poets are prone to play with this, but in most cases, poetry does not go all the way across the page, which means somebody somewhere is making an intentional decision about when to go to the next line. So pay attention to line. And I'm putting, with Mary Oliver, putting meter in with line because meter is really the pattern of syllables and accents that make up a line. A foot is a metrical unit, so the most common foot in the English language and English language poetry is the iambic foot, which is an unaccented syllable followed by an accented one, the bump bump, and this is the heartbeat rhythm. So just listen to "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening." I'm not going to read all of it, but this is, I think, almost perfectly iambic. And when we say a poem is iambic, it doesn't mean always that every single line of the poem is iambic, but in general, it is iambic. But this one is consistently throughout. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. Da-dun, 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 da-dun. Right? It's iambic tetrameter. Yeah, 4 feet. So you have whose woods these are, I think I know. You have 4 iambic feet in there. Okay, so what's the topic here? Somebody's riding through the woods on his horse. Dun, 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 dun. His house is in the village. So we don't read it like that, obviously, but that's the underlying rhythm. It's a very, natural, a very riderly, kind of rhythm. But there's also, because it's not iambic pentameter, which is the most. Would be dun 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 dun. That's a little bit longer, more drawn out, and that's more thoughtful. There's a little bit of tension here in the whose woods these are. I think I know. His house is in the village, though. Like we're going somewhere, right? We're not just sitting back and thinking about it. Um, so then also, yeah, pay attention, of course, to where the line breaks. And we have generally two kinds of lines. We have the self-enclosed line, which finishes a thought, and then enjambment, where the thought kind of runs over. And all of these, I mean, there's some, I guess you could, my little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. So that kind of runs over, but there's still, like, my little horse must think it queer. That's a more or less a self-enclosed line. There's not a lot of, like most of these lines, they work as a line. I'll show you some examples of like extreme enjambment. Again, Gerard Manley Hopkins, who enjams across words, like splits words, you know. But before we get there, line, think about what you can do with line. George Herbert, The Altar. A broken altar, Lord, thy servant rears, iambic pentameter, made of a heart and cemented with tears, made of a heart and cemented with tears, whose parts are as thy hand did frame. So we go from iambic pentameter, 2 lines of iambic pentameter, whose parts are as thy hand did frame, 2 lines of tetrameter. No workman's tool hath touched the same. A heart alone is such a stone as nothing but thy power doth cut. He's not just being cute with this. Of course, it does make the shape of an altar, but note right when he starts talking about a heart alone is such a stone. Where'd the heartbeat rhythm? Bum, 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 bum. And then at the other end, we as we make the base of the altar, we again repeat that 2 lines of iambic tetrameter, and then finish with iambic pentameter. It creates this altar. Line breaks are significant. This one is, highlights maybe more than some do. Think about these first 2 lines. This is from the first stanza of a poem by Christina Rossetti. Good Lord, today I scarce find breath to say. You could have that as perfect as iambic pentameter. You could have good Lord, today I scarce find breath to say, scourge but receive me. But what's the difference between? And I don't have an example of putting it up in the top, but why is it significant? How does it feel different to break after today? Good Lord, today. Sorry.
She's out of breath.
Yeah, she's out of breath. We naturally, when we're reading it, and you should always read poetry out loud, we naturally want to breathe at the end of a line. And we could say a whole line of iambic pentameter in a full breath. Mary Oliver actually makes the point that it's about the perfect amount that you can say in one breath, iambic pentameter. So it has that kind of natural. Good Lord, today I scarce find breath to say. But if you read it, good Lord, today I scarce find breath to say. Scourge but receive me, for stripes are hard to bear, but worse thy intolerable curse, so do not leave me. She's breathless, and you're enacting that in the poem. The poem enacts that breathlessness if you read it aloud. You almost have this feeling of asphyxiation or anxiety. If you've ever had anxiety, like how hard it is to get your breath, right? And she dealt very deeply with these things. And then we really should just spend all the time with this wonderful poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins again, To Christ Our Lord, the wind hovered, to Christ our Lord. I don't have much to say about it, but I find it just wonderful how he breaks the word kingdom across the first line. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled John-drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level underneath him steady air and striding high there. How he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, then off forth on swing, as skate's heels sweep smooth on a bow bend. The hurl and gliding rebuffed the big bird. My heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of the mastery of the thing. Read this poem over and over and over again. I'm going to leave it there because we won't have time to do justice to it. But just notice the enjambment in his riding of the rolling level underneath him steady air. He's talking about this kestrel, this wind hover that's like hovering. And so it's like you have this just this continuous movement, right? It's just dappled John-drawn falcon in his riding of the rolling level underneath him steady air. So he's like Hopkins is just doing wonderfully inventive things there with line breaks in particular. All right, voice. So voice is a bit hard to define. So we have sound, we have line, we have voice. Voice has to do with diction, with word choice. Of course, individual words have particular meaning or sounds. They have meanings. And we have denotation, connotation, kind of the atmosphere that they create. So I think of sound as kind of a subset, almost, of voice. Voice is a bit bigger, a bit more, maybe more intangible. Voice has to do with tone, the overall effect of the poem. And if you read enough of one poet's work, you start associating this voice with a particular poet. I've read enough T.S. Eliot that you give me a few lines from T.S. Eliot that I haven't read, and I can pretty quickly tell you that it's T.S. Eliot or Hopkins or George Herbert or whoever your poet of choice is. Poets start developing their own voice. I'm not going to do anything more with stopping by Woods. Just as a quick example of this, the voice between John Donne and George Herbert are their voices are dramatically different, even as they write about similar kinds of things. And so I give you two sonnets here, both of which struggle with the love of God, receiving the love of God. But I mean, John Donne is just he's a bit of a drama queen, you know. Like it's just, well, let's just read it. Batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. There's some serious alliteration going on there. I, like an usurped town to another do, labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captive and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I accept you, enthrall me, shall never be free. And of course, he's playing on like the original word of the word, or meaning of the word enthrall is to imprison. Except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. I mean, it's graphic. It's violent. I'm a town taken over by Satan. I need your love to break me down, batter me, batter my heart, three-person God. And this is just a representative example, but that's kind of John Donne. Like it's oh and whoa and my goodness. So, and Herbert can do that, but Herbert is always a bit more controlled. He's maybe not quite as emotionally self-indulgent as John Donne tends to be. This is Herbert's famous poem at the end of his collection, The Temple. It's just a completely different connotation. And of course, it has to do with the words. A lot of it has to do with the words that he uses. Words like dust and sin and sweet. But it's not a besieged city. It's a banqueting hall. So it has to also do with metaphor and all, or like what metaphor he's choosing. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful. Ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? These metaphysical poets love their puns. Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. And so I did sit and eat. So he's overwhelmed by love in the same way that Dunn wants to be, right? But it's a completely different voice, different feel. It's just one thing just to note, just by the way, is love is this hostess of this banquet. The first is an invitation, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. And then at the end of the second stanza, it's this challenge, a rhetorical question that challenges, who made the eyes but I? You're not going to get away from me that easily. Who made the eyes but I? And then the interruption at the end. Also notice the position of the bodies. Love draws near first. Love took my hand. And then at the end, you must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. It's a command. So I did sit and eat. And the finality of that is it's a magnificent poem, one of the best poems in the world. And Simone Weil, the theologian mystic, she recounts a mystical experience of coming to Christ through this poem, where she dealt with significant migraines and depression, and where this poem was kind of the central piece of her bringing her to God. You know, if I would believe in an open canon of Scripture, I'm pretty sure I don't know what I believe about that, but this would get close, right? But of course, Herbert, he wrote most of these, you know, as devotional poems, exercises between himself and the Lord, and you know, famously said if they help some poor dejected soul, have them published; if not, have them burned. And we are grateful that Nicholas Farrar chose to have them published. Right, imagery. Most poems have something to do with imagery. Imagery has several subcategories. Symbolism, which is a one-to-one correspondence between object and idea, this thing that means something else. More often, poetry works in the realm of figurative language. So there's degrees of I guess symbolism within this. We have metaphor, where the moon is cheese, right? We have simile, which is the moon is like cheese. The problem with simile, like simile is great, it's fine, but it's weaker than metaphor because it kind of admits that, you know, it's not really cheese. Like the moon really isn't cheese. But so metaphor is a bit more direct. Poetry is quoting Walker, I forget the first name. Poetry is radically non-surface, anti-materialistic, and non-literal because at its heart lies metaphor, and metaphor is subversive. When reading a metaphor for a fleeting moment, you see the two terms as married, and you understand the truth, which is a third thing beyond either of the two terms. Moving between the two terms of the metaphor, we can glimpse the third thing, which isn't available in either of the two terms. Metaphor ignites the sensible world to make us experience meaning that can't be apprehended by the other senses. And I'm currently reading an interesting book by Owen Barfield called Poetic Diction, and he makes the claim that this thing that poetry does with language, by bringing two unlike things together, there's both similarity and difference in metaphor, but by bringing these two things that aren't the same thing together, it's the only way that we really expand knowledge. We can expand understanding with rational thought, with linear thought, rational thought, but it is only through the poetic use of metaphor that we can actually increase knowledge, where all of a sudden, like, yeah, there is this connection between these two things. And, you know, is it intrinsic? I mean, some people just accuse poets of making it up, right? And maybe that's true, but the fact that it happened in their brain, you know, it speaks to something of the reality there. But there is this correspondence, I think, between like metaphor isn't just, you know, you can't just dismiss it as poetic whimsy. It is a creative attempt at, you know, looking at the world in a different way, and so speaks to something of the reality of the world. All right, so allusion is, you know, referring to something. Personification, where inanimate objects take on human characteristics. And then there's also the thing of texture. and then finally image for its own sake. And I'm just going to highlight a few of these as we go. Metaphor, this wonderful poem by George Herbert, Prayer, the Church's Banquet, Angel's Age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, engine against the Almighty, sinner's tower, reversed thunder, Christ side-piercing spear, the 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear, softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manna, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. So we have all these metaphors, and we end with this kind of very productively vague, ambiguous something understood. What's the something and who's understanding it, right? But just fantastic poem. It's really a string of metaphors talking about prayer. And the best commentary that I can offer on this is Malcolm Geit's recent collection of poems after prayer, where he writes a sonnet. He takes each of these, I think, 24 metaphors and writes a sonnet for each of them. And it's really, really wonderful. I had the chance of hearing him read it, and I'm sure you can find recordings on YouTube of him reading it. But it's the best commentary I can offer on this. He says, most poets would kill for a single really rich metaphor for a poem, and here Herbert just gives us 24 or so very, very productive ones, or not productive, but fertile. But there's also, so there's metaphor, but there's also just texture. Or I say just texture. I feel like even texture has the possibility of metaphor, but it's less directly like this thing stands for something, but it's texture. And I think of, again, Hopkins. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in a stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-cold chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, full fallow and plow, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, adazzle, dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change, praise him. Just tons of texture there. Texture in Seamus Heaney's Digging. This is a selection from his poem. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head, but I have no spade to follow men like them. So of course, the sound of the words are contributing to this, but this is, you want to go wash your hands after this, like the squelch and slap of soggy peat, right? It's texture. There's allusion, but then there's also just imagery for the sake of imagery. And of course, the Imagists were famous for this. Think of the poem, "So much depends on the red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens." I think I'm getting that right? It's just the image for the image's sake, right? It's just pure image, like a poetic rendering. It's like a little work of art, like a little miniature, almost like a picture in words. So there's also image for image's sake. And one guy that maybe is a bit different from who I am talking about here, but it has been influenced by T.S. Eliot, the symbolists, the imagists is Bob Dylan, and he takes it in a kind of surrealist direction, which of course T.S. Eliot's not above that, as where you just have this very vibrant image, like it seems to be alluding to something, but you're not really sure what it is. But boy, does it ever stick with you. And this is from his "A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall." "Oh, what do you see, my blue-eyed son? Oh, what did you see, my darling young one? I saw a newborn baby with wild wolves all around it. I saw a highway of diamonds with nobody on it. I saw a black branch with blood that kept dripping. I saw a room full of men with their hammers a-bleeding. Maybe they're connected to the blood that's dripping from the black branch. I saw a white ladder all covered with water. I saw 10,000 talkers whose tongues were all broken. I saw guns and sharp swords in the hands of young children. And it's a hard, and it's a hard, it's a hard, it's a hard, and it's a hard rain, it's gonna fall." It's, of course, a song. But you have this these very almost surreal images, but pay attention to what it does to you, how it sticks with you, what it does in your gut. Maybe there's a reading of this that has specific allusion. We know exactly what Bob Dylan was thinking about when he was writing this. I'm pretty sure he did not, and he would laugh at you if you asked him. But it's the image. Oh boy, form, and I'm including shape here with form. Form has to do with the overall structure of the thing, the shape that it takes as a whole. So line is about the particular thing or particular lines. Form includes line and how everything looks. So this has a very clear form. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house in the village, though, it's iambic tetrameter all the way through. 4 stanzas. It has a nice straight shape. We have a very intricate rhyme scheme that we saw earlier. Form also looks something like this. Of course, this is Herbert's famous concrete or pattern poems. And again, just notice how the words interact with the shape. So it's not just, oh, this is cute, I'm going to make a poem with wings. It actually, the language supports it. So, Lord, who createst man in wealth and store, iambic pentameter, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more till he became most poor, 2 syllables. With thee, O let me rise as larks harmoniously and sing this day thy victories, then shall the fall further the flight in me. You have this, it's the motion of beating wings. My tender age in sorrow did begin, and still with sicknesses and shame, thou didst so punish sin that I became most thin at the thinnest part of the poem. With thee, notice how both of these stanzas turn on with thee. And this was a huge concept for Herbert. I mean, this was with Christ. Withness with Christ was like the operative thing for him. With thee, let me combine and feel thy day, thy victory. For if I imp my wing on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me. So, form. One of the most common forms in the English language is the sonnet, and I do not have the time, unfortunately, to just go deep into the sonnet, but you should know 14 lines, sonnets are 14 lines long. That's kind of the baseline. 14 line longs usually have iambic pentameter, right? So if you see a blocky poem that looks something like this and looks like it could possibly be like, kind of a, this shape, 14 lines, most likely the poet is working within the sonnet form. Fixed rhyme scheme in most cases, so you have an octave. In this case, the Petrarchan form is octave and a sestet. So let me see, make sure that I'm right here. Yeah. Whoops. Anyway, we'll leave it. So octave, 8 lines. It has ABBA, rhyme scheme. Again, Petrarchan, Shakespeare, or the English sonnet does something a bit different. And then a sestet that brings it home. Sonnets are often exploring ideas. They're reflecting on usually some kind of metaphysical problem. Not always, but in most cases. This is from Vassar Miller. Except ourselves, we have no other prayer. Our needs are sores upon our nakedness. We do not have to name them. We are here. And you who can make eyes can see no less. So we have that first, actually this is not ABBA, this is ABAB. We fall not on our knees, but on our hearts, a posture far humbler far and more downcast, while Father Pain instructs us in the arts of praying. While Father Pain instructs us in the arts of praying, hunger is the worthiest fast. We find ourselves where tongues cannot wage war on silence. Farther mystics never flew, but on the common wings of what we are, borne on the wings of what we bear toward you, O word in whom our wordiness dissolves, when we have not a prayer except ourselves. As a sonnet, it's interesting, but just, it's without ceremony. Notice the without. We begin with a negation, without ceremony. Accept ourselves, negation. We have no other prayer, negation. Our needs are sores upon our nakedness. Nakedness, being without clothes. We do not have to name them, do not. We are here, can see no less. So there's this, it's just over and over, this image of negation. But especially formally notice how the poem ends with this virtually the same line as you begin with. Accept ourselves, we have no other prayer. When we have not a prayer, except ourselves. And so they have this wonderful, self-contained. This is a poem about the only thing we have to bring is ourselves to prayer. Even asking to be silenced. We find ourselves where tongues cannot wage war on silence. So you have this movement towards silence, and then the poem kind of closes itself. Kind of ends in that silence that it asks for. So it's a wonderful, formal piece. William Wordsworth famously talked about the sonnet's scanty plot of ground in the form of a sonnet, because poets like to be interesting that way. Ourselves, the whole thing is about working within limits. Within the sonnet's scanty plot of ground, pleased if some souls, for such their needs must be, who have felt the weight of too much liberty, should find brief solace there as I have found. So an appeal to the sonnet. It's a very constrained form, but it can also give you, within those boundaries, there's a lot of freedom that can happen. Promptness. All right, let's talk about a few traditional forms. And I'm going to give you my rapid fire how to read poetry, because we're not even there yet. Ballad. Ballad is 4 lines, iambic. 4 iambic lines that follow 4-3-4-3 stress pattern. He holds him with his glittering eye, the wedding guest stood still, and listens like a 3 years child. The mariner hath his will. This is from the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. So we recognize this as a song form. And I think I will make this PowerPoint available to whoever wants it if you ask me. Blank verse is unrhymed iambic pentameter, free verse, dramatic monologue. I'm going to skip over this and talk about a few things, how to read poetry in conclusion. And I'm going to go over these. I intended to go over them rapidly, but I'll even have to go more rapidly than I intended. So the first, I have 20-ish strategies. I think it's about 18, but some of these could be worked together. And I'm in conversation with Mark Yakic's 2014, you recognize it?
My good friend.
Oh, good friend. Oh, yeah, wonderful. His 2014 article in The Atlantic, reading a poem, 20 strategies. It's just really, really delightful read. I'll be quoting some of him as I go here. The first strategy is to surrender. C.S. Lewis says the first demand of any work of art makes upon us is surrender. Look, listen, receive, get yourself out of the way. I do not mean that the right spectator is passive. His is also an imaginative activity, but an obedient one. He seems passive at first because he is making sure of his orders. But receive it. Surrender. Give yourself to it. Notice the obvious. Again, quoting from M.H. Abrams, the necessary, though not sufficient condition for a competent reader of poetry remains what it has always been, a keen eye for the obvious. Don't look for the elusive hidden meaning or that golden key that unlocks all possible meanings. It usually doesn't exist. Look instead for patterns of meaning and start working those patterns of meaning towards some kind of coherent interpretation. So go through, maybe read it 5 times for each of the elements and notice what each of the elements are doing. Usually there's some kind of coherence that's happening there. Slow down. This is not reading poetry is not a time to speed read. Wait, have patience. Poems can be awfully shy, but most respond to loving attention. Mark Yakic says in the article, if poem can feel like a locked safe in which the combination is hidden inside. In other words, it's okay if you don't understand a poem. Sometimes it takes dozens of readings to come to the slightest understanding, and sometimes understanding never comes. It's the same thing with being alive. Wonder and confusion mostly prevail. Read it again and again and again and again. Mark it up. Again, from Mark Yakich, reading without writing in the margins is like walking without moving your arms. You can do it and still reach your destination, but it'll always feel like you're missing something essential about the activity. Read it aloud. Poems are nothing if not exercises in sound, so read it aloud. Memorize them. Make them a part of your soul. I recently memorized, I don't do enough of this, but I recently memorized the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock just because it's stuck with me now for many, many years, from a pretentious, when do you stop being pretentious? But like a pretentious youngster who listened to it just because, I guess it was interesting, to kind of hitting me broadside in my undergraduate experience. Still don't understand. I understand it, but I can't like paraphrase all of it or interpret it because you're not supposed to. You can't. But it's there. Memorizing it makes it a part of you. Use a dictionary. If you don't know a word, look it up. And most words, like light switch, have multiple possible meanings. That one's going to stick with me for a while. Separate as much as possible the speaker of the poem from the poet. This is not always possible, not always necessary, but poets do at times take on different personas. And so think in terms of the speaker of the poet. Let the poem speak. Quoting Mark Yakich, try to meet the poem on its own terms, not yours. In other words, don't try to fit the poem into your life. Try to see the world the poem creates. Then, if you are lucky, its world will help you re-see your own. Again, this thing comes back to this thing of love. What is this kind of, Gelassenheit or yieldedness? Like let it speak, and then see how it works into your own life. So it does. The experience of that kind of self-abandonment can be thrilling in itself, but let the poem speak. Don't worry about whether the author intended it. It's important, but I think I've not written much poetry, but I'm always amazed that when a poem really comes, how the language can do something that you never really intended. Like it's like oh, I'll write something and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Did I intend that? Well, no, but it's there. Words are alive. I love Geit's poem on, I think it's called Hospitality, where he talks about like inviting, like the poet's job is to kind of invite words into a room and seating them where they like to sit, and then you let them go after you've entertained them, and sometimes they leave a poem behind. So this is wonderful. Like poets are not. They're not industrial. What do you call people who invent things? They're primarily making tools to be used, like where everything is like an intention. They're working with words. So don't worry so much about whether the author intended it. Worry about what's in front of you, or enjoy what's in front of you. Don't hate it just because you don't get it. It may not be the poem's problem, and it's okay. It's not a reflection on you. I mean, sometimes it might be, but it's not always. We are sometimes not ready for it, intellectually, spiritually. There is poetry that speaks to me now that did not speak to me in high school. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, for instance. You think a Gothic, literary ballad would have spoken to me in high school. It's like, yeah, but it speaks volumes to me now. It's wonderful. So don't hate it just because you don't get it. Don't assume it's profound just because it's obscure. Don't assume it's simple just because it's accessible. Poems, like people, can be open and gregarious, or they can be enigmatic and isolated, and you can be extremely shallow as in both kinds of situations. So being enigmatic doesn't mean you're deep. Being accessible and open and gregarious doesn't mean you're shallow. So just poems are the same way. Don't force yourself to like it if you don't. But like coffee and classical music, it's okay to try. It's okay to try to like it. If you're intrigued, start there. Love first, then analyze. Analysis is love seeking understanding. I loved T.S. Eliot before I understood him. I still don't understand a lot of things, but I love it. And in that love, there is an understanding. Just because you can paraphrase it doesn't mean you understand it. And I would say vice versa. Just because you understand it doesn't mean you can paraphrase it. I think poets have to be careful not to claim some kind of Gnostic knowledge. It can really turn people off. It's like, well, if you don't get it, you're like, if you don't get it, you don't get it. You know, like you're the problem. So don't, like, if you're being an ambassador for poetry, that's not a good way to be an ambassador for poetry. But understanding isn't just being able to paraphrase it. Poetry won't save your life, but it can help. And I will end with words, Mark Yakich's words. Someday, when all your material possessions will seem to have shed their utility and just become obstacles to the toilet, poems will still hold their value. They are rooms that take up such little room. I think it obviously has to be playing on this thing of poems as rooms. There we have it again. A memorized poem or a line or two becomes part internal jewelry and part life-saving skill, like knowing how to put a mugger in an arm lock or the best way to cut open a mango without slicing your hand. Reading a good poem doesn't give you something to talk about. It silences you. Reading a great poem pushes further. It prepares you for the silence that perplexes us all.